Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that might seem a little bit strange at first, especially if you're just starting out learning English. We're talking about the power of slow speech. We've got a transcript here from the Speak Smart podcast, and they make a really great argument for why taking things slower can actually help you learn faster. So get ready for some aha moments. We're going to uncover some really interesting strategies.
It's really interesting how the podcast addresses that feeling that a lot of beginners have, that feeling of being overwhelmed. Like when you hear English and it just sounds like a jumbled mess. It's like when you're trying to tune a radio and all you get is static.
Yeah, I totally get that. It's like hitting fast forward on a song by accident and your brain just can't keep up. But that's where the Speak Smart podcast comes in. They argue that slowing down the speech is like finding that clear signal on the radio dial. So your brain can actually process the sounds and the words and start to make sense of everything.
Exactly. Slow speech gives your brain the space it needs to really absorb the language. It's like taking a leisurely stroll through a garden. You can really appreciate all the details, the individual flowers, the scents, instead of just sprinting through and missing everything.
I love that analogy. And it makes so much sense. When you slow down, you can focus on the sounds, the rhythm, the intonation.
Right. And they emphasize that slow speech isn't about talking like a robot. It's more about finding a pace that's comfortable for you, where your brain can catch up and start to recognize patterns.
And that's where the real learning happens, right? When you start recognizing those patterns.
Absolutely. It's like building a foundation. You start to anticipate what's coming next. You pick up on the nuances of pronunciation, and it just becomes so much easier to understand the flow of conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about why slow speech is important, but how do we actually use it to improve our listening skills? The Speak Smart podcast outlines some really practical exercises you can do at home. The first one is called Transcribe and Compare, and it sounds like a really great way to train your ears.
Oh, it is. The idea is pretty simple. You take a short audio or video clip in English, something that has subtitles or a transcript, and you try to write down everything you hear. Then you compare your version to the actual transcript.
Wow. It's like putting your listening skills to the test. I could see how that would be super helpful in identifying areas where you might be struggling.
Exactly. It forces you to focus on each word and sound, and it shows you where the gaps are in your understanding. Did you miss a word because of the pronunciation? Or maybe a particular grammar structure threw you off? This exercise helps you pinpoint those areas so you can work on them.
I'm already adding this to my study routine. It sounds super effective. Okay, the next exercise they talk about is repeat and shadow, which sounds almost like a game. You listen to short phrases, pause the audio, and then try to repeat them out loud. You try to mimic the speaker's pronunciation and intonation as closely as possible.
Yeah, it's like having a conversation with the speaker, trying to match their rhythm and tone. And they really emphasize that it's okay to make mistakes. It's all part of the learning process.
I love that. It takes the pressure off.
Right. And what's really interesting is that this exercise not only helps with your listening, but it also helps you become more comfortable with producing the sounds yourself.
It's like building muscle memory for your mouth. I like that. Okay, the next exercise is really creative. It's called Draw What You Hear. This one involves listening to a descriptive audio clip and then sketching out what you're visualizing in your mind.
This one's great for visual learners. It adds a whole other sensory element to your practice. You're connecting words with images, so you're not just hearing the language, but experiencing it in a more holistic way.
I love that. It makes it more engaging and memorable. The Speak Smart podcast also talks about the importance of choosing the right content for slow speech practice. They say it shouldn't be too easy, but also not so difficult that you feel completely lost. It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Absolutely. Finding that balance is key. You want something that challenges you, but not something that's so difficult it becomes demotivating.
Yep. And the good news is there's so much amazing slow speech content out there. The podcast mentions podcasts, of course, but also audiobooks, YouTube videos, even slow tempo music.
There's something for everyone. For podcasts, they recommend exploring platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and looking for ones that are designed for language learners or ones that have transcripts available.
And for audiobooks, they suggest checking out resources like Audible or your local library. I bet libraries have a great selection of audiobooks for English language learners.
I'm sure they do. And YouTube is another great resource. Channels like Learn English with Emma are really popular.
And for music lovers, there are tons of options too. They suggest looking for lyric videos so you can follow along with the words.
There are also artists and channels that specialize in creating music for language learners.
It's amazing how much variety there is. The Speak Smart podcast also gives some great tips for maximizing your learning with slow speech. They talk about the importance of patience. It takes time to develop these skills. And they encourage regular practice, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
Consistency is key. Even small bursts of practice can make a big difference over time.
They also recommend using subtitles or transcripts whenever possible. It's like having a built-in support system as you listen.
It helps reinforce your understanding and catch any words or phrases you might have missed.
And most importantly, they emphasize having fun. If you're enjoying the content, you'll be much more likely to stick with it.
Motivation is everything. Choose topics and genres that you're interested in, and don't be afraid to experiment. Find what works for you.
Now let's talk about what happens when you're ready to move beyond slow speech, when you're ready to start tackling normal-paced English. Because ultimately, you want to be able to understand real-world conversations
Absolutely.
without feeling completely lost.
Right. The Speak Smart podcast offers some really good strategies for bridging that gap. It's like transitioning from training wheels to riding your bike solo. It might feel a little wobbly at first, but with the right approach, you'll gain confidence and speed in no time.
Okay, so what are some of their suggestions for making this transition smoother?
Well, one of their key recommendations is to gradually increase the listening speed on your media player. Start by listening to content at a slightly slower pace than normal, and then slowly nudge the speed up over time.
I see. So you're slowly getting your ears and brain used to the faster pace.
Exactly. And they suggest revisiting content you're already familiar with, but listening to it at a faster pace. Since you already have a grasp of the overall message, you can focus on picking up the details at the quicker speed.
That's a good idea. It's like taking a familiar route but driving a little faster each time.
Exactly. And as you're listening, they emphasize paying attention to patterns in the language. Notice common phrases, intonation patterns, and sentence structures.
That's interesting. It's like becoming a detective for the English language.
Exactly. The more you can anticipate what might come next, the easier it becomes to understand faster speech.
So it's like solving a puzzle. The more pieces you can predict, the clearer the whole picture becomes.
Okay, so you've been practicing with slow speech. You're gradually increasing your listening speed, and you're starting to notice those patterns in the language. But what about building confidence in actual real-world interactions? That can feel like a whole different ballgame.
You're absolutely right. And the Speak Smart podcast offers some great advice on that front as well. They recommend a couple of exercises that I think you'll find really helpful. The first is role-playing conversations.
Oh, role-playing. That's a classic for a reason.
Exactly. It's like a dress rehearsal for real-life situations. You choose common scenarios like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions, and then practice those conversations with a partner.
It's a safe space to experiment with the language and get comfortable with using it spontaneously.
Exactly. The other exercise they suggest is called listen and imitate, which builds on the repeat and shadow technique we talked about earlier.
So it's like repeat and shadow 2.0. You could say that. It focuses more on mimicking the nuances of pronunciation and intonation. You choose a short audio clip, something with clear speech like a news report or a dialogue from a TV show, and you listen to it carefully several times. Then you try to imitate the speaker as closely as possible, paying attention to all those subtle details, how they pronounce the words, how they use their voice.
Wow, it's like having a personal pronunciation coach right in your pocket.
Exactly. And they even recommend recording yourself and comparing it to the original audio to see where you can improve.
That's a brilliant tip. It's like having instant feedback on your pronunciation.
It really is. So with all this great advice and these practical exercises, you're well on your way to mastering English listening. But as they emphasize in the podcast, the journey doesn't end there. It's about embracing the challenges that come up and staying motivated even when progress feels slow.
Let's talk about some of those challenges then. The challenges people might face when transitioning to normal-paced English. Because let's be honest, it can be overwhelming at times.
Absolutely. One common challenge is feeling bombarded by the sheer speed of native speakers. It's easy to get discouraged when you can't catch every word or understand every detail.
So instead of trying to understand every single word,
Right. Try to shift your focus to grasping the main ideas and the overall context. Think of it like listening to a news report. You don't need to memorize every statistic or detail to understand the main point.
that's a helpful way to reframe it. Another challenge that many people experience is maintaining motivation, especially when progress feels slow. It's easy to get impatient and want to see results immediately. But language learning is a long game.
It really is. And that's where the Speak Smart podcast offers some great advice. Set realistic goals. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. Break down your learning into smaller, more achievable steps. Did you learn a new phrase today? Did you understand a bit more of that podcast episode than you did last week? Those are wins worth celebrating.
Absolutely. It's all about those small victories that keep you moving forward.
And they also highlight the importance of connecting with other learners. Finding a language exchange partner or joining a study group can be a game changer.
Yeah, having that support system can make a world of difference, especially when you're facing those inevitable bumps in the road.
It's amazing how much a sense of community can boost your motivation and make the whole learning process more enjoyable.
So we've talked about the power of slow speech, practical exercises for improving your listening skills, strategies for transitioning to normal-paced English, and the importance of embracing the journey, celebrating those small wins, and finding a supportive community. Before we wrap up part 1, I think it's important to circle back to a core message that really resonated with me from the Speak Smart podcast.
I'm all ears. What resonated with you the most?
It was their emphasis on language learning being a journey, not a race. It's so easy to get caught up in wanting to be fluent as quickly as possible. But the Speak Smart podcast reminds us to enjoy the process, the ups and downs, to find joy in the small steps.
I completely agree. It's like climbing a mountain. You know there will be tough parts, moments when you want to give up. But when you get to the top, the view is incredible.
I love that analogy. And in this case, the view is being able to connect with people from different cultures, understand new perspectives, and experience the world in a richer way.
Exactly.
Speaking of those tough parts, the Speak Smart podcast has a whole section on overcoming obstacles and staying motivated. I found their advice really helpful, especially for those times when you feel overwhelmed or discouraged.
Oh, yeah. Those feelings are totally normal. And it's important to have ways to deal with them. One thing the podcast talks about is focusing on the big picture, not getting stuck on every single word you don't understand.
Right. It's like getting lost in the details instead of seeing the whole forest.
Exactly. And they suggest a really helpful shift in perspective. Instead of trying to understand every single word, aim for understanding the main ideas and the context, like when you're listening to the news. You don't need to remember every single fact or number to get the main point.
That makes sense. Another challenge they talk about is staying motivated, especially when you don't feel like you're making progress.
Yeah, that can be tough. But that's where setting realistic goals comes in. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. It takes time.
Right.
Break down your learning into smaller steps. Celebrate those small wins. Did you learn a new phrase today? Did you understand a bit more of that podcast than last week? Those are things to be proud of.
I love that.
They also talk about the importance of connecting with other learners, finding a language exchange partner, or joining a study group.
It's like having a workout buddy for your language skills.
Exactly. You can share tips, encourage each other, celebrate each other's successes, and practice together.
It makes the whole process more fun and less lonely.
Absolutely.
So to recap, we've talked about the power of slow speech, practical exercises for improving your listening skills, strategies for transitioning to normal-paced English, and the importance of embracing the journey, celebrating small wins, and finding a supportive community.
And let's not forget one of the most important things. Be patient with yourself. Language learning takes time and effort. There will be times when you feel frustrated, times when you feel like you're not making progress. But trust the process.
This is like planting a seed. You have to nurture it, give it time, and eventually it will bloom.
Beautifully said. And in the case of language learning, that bloom is the ability to connect with the world in a whole new way.
It's so rewarding. The Speak Smart podcast really highlights both the practical steps and the mindset you need to succeed. They give you this amazing toolbox of strategies and encouragement, reminding us that even though there are challenges, the path to fluency is ultimately a path of joy and discovery.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into the Speak Smart podcast, we want to leave you with some key takeaways, things to remember on your own language learning journey.
Sounds good.
First and foremost, slow speech is a powerful tool, especially if you're just starting out. It helps you process the language at a pace that's comfortable for you and build a solid foundation.
And don't forget about those practical exercises we talked about. Whether it's transcribing and comparing, repeating and shadowing, or drawing what you hear, these techniques can make a real difference in your listening skills.
And they make learning more fun too.
Exactly.
As you get better, remember that transitioning to normal-paced English takes time. Start by slowly increasing the speed on your media player. Revisit familiar content at a faster pace. And pay attention to patterns in the language.
And most importantly, be patient with yourself. Celebrate those small wins and find a supportive community to share the experience with.
The Speak Smart podcast reminds us that language learning isn't just about learning new words and grammar. It's about expanding your world, connecting with others, and discovering new ways of thinking and being.
It really is.
So embrace the challenge, find joy in the process, and never give up on your dream of mastering English.
Before we move on to part 3, I'm curious, what aspect of English listening do you find most challenging right now?
Is it keeping up with fast conversations? Or understanding different accents? Or maybe it's those tricky idioms and slang expressions.
Those are all really common challenges, and it's helpful to figure out which one is the biggest hurdle for you so you can really focus on it. The good thing is that there are so many resources and techniques out there to help you with whatever you're struggling with.
I agree. And speaking of resources, I'm curious, what kind of slow speech content has been helpful for you in your own language learning? Have you found any hidden gems, any podcasts, YouTube channels, audiobooks that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Oh, I have a whole bunch of recommendations. One podcast I really love is Voice of America, Learning English. They have all sorts of programs about current events, science, culture, American idioms, and it's all spoken at a slower pace with really clear pronunciation.
That sounds great. I'm going to check that out. I'm also a big fan of the 6-Minute English podcast for the BBC. They cover a lot of interesting topics, and each episode is only 6 minutes long, so it's perfect for when you only have a few minutes to practice.
And if you prefer video, I highly recommend the YouTube channel Easy English. They have these really engaging videos with subtitles that explain complex topics in a way that's easy to understand.
Those are some awesome recommendations. It's so great to see so many resources available, all designed to make learning English easier and more fun. Speaking of fun, the Speak Smart podcast really emphasized how important it is to enjoy the process.
It really is. When you're having fun, you're more likely to stick with it, and you'll actually make more progress. It's like anything else. If it feels like a chore, you're not going to want to do it.
That's so true. And there are so many ways to make language learning fun. You can watch movies and TV shows with subtitles, listen to music and sing along, even cook a meal following a recipe in English.
Those are great ideas. It's all about finding ways to incorporate English into your daily life so it doesn't feel like this separate thing you have to do.
I like that. And the Speak Smart podcast also talked about how those moments of frustration can actually be opportunities for growth.
Right. When you hit a roadblock, don't think of it as a failure. Think of it as a chance to learn and try something different.
It's like those strength training workouts. You're pushing your muscles to their limits.
Yeah.
And that's how they get stronger.
I love that analogy. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many other people learning English who are going through the same things as you.
It's so helpful to connect with other learners, whether it's online or in person, sharing your experiences and learning from each other.
Absolutely. It's like having a whole team of people cheering you on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Speak Smart podcast, let's celebrate the power of slow speech, the joy of learning, and the amazing ability we all have to keep going even when things get tough.
Cheers to that. To all the English learners out there, keep up the great work.
And thank you for listening to the Speak Smart podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that like button. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.